What if one court decision could instantly change gun laws across the country? That's exactly what just happened. In a major legal development, a federal court has struck down a controversial large-capacity magazine ban, ruling that the restriction violates the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. To understand why this court decision is such a major development, it's important to first understand what the magazine ban actually did and why it became so controversial. The law targeted firearm magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition. In simple terms, a magazine is the component of a firearm that stores and feeds ammunition into the gun. Under these types of laws, magazines that exceed the 10-round limit are often referred to as large-capacity magazines, and several states have attempted to regulate or ban them over the past decade. Supporters of these bans argued that limiting magazine capacity could potentially reduce the number of rounds a shooter could fire without reloading. Advocates claimed this could create pauses during incidents of violence, which they believed might give victims a chance to escape or allow law enforcement more time to intervene. Because of these concerns, lawmakers in certain states passed legislation restricting the sale, possession, or transfer of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. However, critics strongly challenged these laws from a constitutional standpoint. Gun rights advocates argued that millions of these magazines are already owned by law-abiding Americans and are commonly used for lawful purposes such as self-defense, recreational shooting, and competitive shooting sports. Because of this widespread ownership, opponents argued that banning them effectively restricts access to equipment that many firearm owners consider standard and widely available. This debate quickly became tied to constitutional protections under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. Opponents of magazine bans claimed that if a firearm accessory is widely owned and typically used for lawful purposes, restricting it raises serious constitutional questions. As a result, magazine bans have become one of the most heavily litigated firearm regulations in the United States. Courts across the country have been asked to determine whether these limits are reasonable public safety measures or whether they improperly restrict rights protected by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The ruling in this case is part of that ongoing national legal debate. The court's decision to strike down the magazine ban centered on constitutional protections for firearm ownership and the legal standards that courts must now use when evaluating gun control laws. In its ruling, the judge concluded that the ban conflicted with protections under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. The key issue was whether restricting certain firearm magazines fits within the types of regulations that are historically consistent with the nation's tradition of firearm laws. A major factor in the court's reasoning came from the legal framework established in the landmark Supreme Court decision New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen. In that 2022 ruling, the Supreme Court changed how lower courts must analyze firearm regulations. Instead of applying a balancing test that weighs public safety against constitutional rights, courts must now focus on historical tradition. Specifically, judges must determine whether a modern firearm restriction is similar to regulations that existed during the early periods of American history, particularly around the time the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were adopted. Applying this standard, the court examined whether there was a historical tradition of banning firearm components that are commonly used by citizens. According to the judge's analysis, the government was unable to provide sufficient historical evidence showing that bans on commonly owned magazines had a clear historical counterpart in earlier American firearm regulations. Without that historical support, the court concluded that the law failed to meet the constitutional test outlined by the Supreme Court. The ruling emphasized that when a firearm or related component falls within the general category of protected arms, the burden shifts to the government to justify restrictions through historical precedent. Because that burden was not met in this case, the court ultimately determined that the magazine ban could not stand under the standards established by New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen and the protections guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Another important part of the court's reasoning involved what legal experts often refer to as the common use principle. This concept comes from earlier Supreme Court rulings interpreting the scope of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. According to this principle, firearms or related equipment that are widely owned by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes generally fall within the protections of the Second Amendment. In other words, if a particular type of firearm or accessory is commonly possessed and typically used for legitimate activities such as self-defense or recreational shooting, banning it outright raises serious constitutional concerns. This idea was reinforced in the landmark Supreme Court case District of Columbia versus Heller. In that decision, the court recognized an individual right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, particularly self-defense within the home. The ruling also suggested that weapons in common use by the public are generally protected, while historically unusual or dangerous weapons could potentially be regulated or restricted. Since that decision, lower courts have often relied on this concept when evaluating whether certain firearm regulations are consistent with constitutional protections. In the case involving the magazine ban, the court examined whether magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds qualify as items in common use. Evidence presented during the case suggested that tens of millions of these magazines exist in civilian ownership across the United States. They are widely sold with many modern firearms and are frequently used in activities such as target shooting, training, and personal protection. Because of this widespread ownership and everyday use, the judge concluded that these magazines cannot easily be classified as rare or unusual equipment. As a result, the court determined that restricting such commonly owned firearm components raises serious constitutional questions. If an item is broadly owned and used for lawful purposes, courts may view a complete ban as inconsistent with the protections recognized in District of Columbia versus Heller and the rights guaranteed under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Following the court's decision to strike down the magazine ban, government officials moved quickly to challenge the ruling through an emergency legal request. In situations like this, when a court invalidates an existing law, the government often asks the court to temporarily pause or stay the decision while the case moves through the appeals process. The purpose of a stay is to prevent immediate legal changes until higher courts have an opportunity to review the ruling more carefully. In this case, officials filed an emergency motion asking the court to block the effect of the ruling that found the magazine ban unconstitutional. Their argument is that allowing the decision to take effect immediately could create legal uncertainty and make enforcement of firearm regulations more difficult, while the appeals process is still ongoing. By requesting an emergency stay, the government is essentially asking the court to maintain the current legal status quo until a higher court determines whether the lower court's decision was correct. Emergency stays are common in high-profile constitutional cases, especially when a ruling could affect public policy or statewide regulations. Courts typically consider several factors when deciding whether to grant such a request. Judges may examine the likelihood that the government could succeed on appeal, whether immediate enforcement of the ruling would cause significant disruption, and whether delaying the decision would cause harm to either side involved in the case. If the stay is granted, the magazine ban could remain in effect temporarily, while the legal challenge continues through the appellate courts. This means that the law would still be enforced despite the lower court ruling against it. However, if the stay request is denied, the decision striking down the ban could take effect immediately, potentially preventing authorities from enforcing those restrictions during the appeals process. Because the case involves constitutional protections under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, the outcome of the stay request could have significant legal consequences while the broader dispute continues to move through the federal court system. After the lower court issued its ruling striking down the magazine ban, the legal battle may continue through the federal appeals process, which could ultimately bring the case before the Supreme Court of the United States. In the American legal system, decisions made by federal district courts are not necessarily the final word. Either side involved in the case has the right to appeal the ruling to a higher court if they believe the judge made an error in interpreting the law or the Constitution. That means the government can challenge the decision and ask an appellate court to review the reasoning behind the ruling. If an appeal is filed, the case would first go to the appropriate federal circuit court of appeals. A panel of judges in that court would review the legal arguments, the lower court's opinion, and the constitutional questions involved. The appeals court could choose to uphold the lower court's decision, overturn it, or send the case back for further review. Because the case centers on constitutional protections related to firearm ownership, the appeals court would likely examine the legal standards established in previous Supreme Court rulings that interpret the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. If the case continues to raise significant constitutional questions, or if different federal courts reach conflicting decisions on similar magazine bans, the issue could eventually be taken up by the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court does not hear every appeal, but it often accepts cases that involve major constitutional disputes or issues that affect laws across multiple states. Because magazine capacity restrictions exist in several jurisdictions, a Supreme Court review could have nationwide consequences. If the justices decide to hear the case, their ruling could clarify how courts should evaluate firearm accessory bans under the Second Amendment. Such a decision would not only determine the fate of this specific magazine ban, but could also influence how similar laws are treated across the country, potentially establishing a binding precedent for future firearm regulation cases. The significance of this case extends far beyond a single state, because magazine capacity restrictions exist in multiple parts of the United States. Several states have adopted laws that limit firearm magazines to a certain number of rounds, most commonly 10. Because of that, a court ruling striking down one of these bans can influence how similar laws are challenged and interpreted elsewhere. Legal experts often pay close attention to these cases because they can shape how courts nationwide approach firearm regulations. At the center of the debate is how courts interpret the protections guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Over the past decade, the Supreme Court has issued several important decisions that expanded and clarified the scope of those protections. In particular, the 2022 ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen significantly changed the legal framework used to evaluate gun laws. Under that decision, courts must determine whether modern firearm regulations are consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States. Because magazine bans are relatively modern policies, courts across the country are now examining whether similar restrictions existed during earlier periods of American history. If courts determine that there is no clear historical precedent for banning commonly owned firearm components, those laws could face serious constitutional challenges. As a result, multiple lawsuits involving magazine restrictions are currently moving through the federal court system. The outcome of this case could therefore influence future rulings in other jurisdictions where similar bans are in place. If higher courts agree with the reasoning used in this decision, it could strengthen legal challenges against comparable laws in other states. On the other hand, if an appeals court or the Supreme Court of the United States reaches a different conclusion, it could reaffirm the ability of governments to impose certain limits on magazine capacity. Either way, the legal questions raised by this case are likely to continue shaping the national debate over firearm regulation and constitutional rights. For now, the key question is whether the emergency block request will succeed. If it does, the magazine ban could stay in place while appeals continue. If not, the ruling could immediately reshape how these laws are enforced. Either way, this legal fight is far from over, and it could soon head toward the Supreme Court of the United States. Stay tuned, because the next decision could have major nationwide consequences.